Welcome back, kings and queens, to your second to last argument as we try to unpack the various views and understandings of how magic functions in the world of Ea, which the setting of the Para Bellum game Conquest. And I wanted to tackle this because I got into a little bit of an analysis paralysis on where to begin as I was talking about a series I wanted to do for the latest book that came out of all the different lore backgrounds for factions that are kind of like on the horizon. I'll leave a link to the video discussing that lore book in the description for this video. But I found myself continuously bumping up against having to explain magic in the setting, and I just didn't want to repeat myself. So I wanted to have a video just talking about the idea of magic and then how all our various factions approach and interact with it. To give me a little bit of an entry point, because next we're going to be diving deep into that lore book. So like I said, today we are talking about magic in the setting of Conquest, specifically the setting's rules and approach to it, and this is all based off of a relatively recent article that came out called Unsanctioned Magic, and I will leave a link to that down below. But rather than being a direct history of the uses of magical power, this article seems more like an observation on how the various races of Ea approach their logic and worldviews with magic. If it can do all these amazing things, what stops it from being an auto-win or a cure-all? How does it not fix every problem? And how do the characters, whether they be people or some other kind of sentient whatever, how do they approach research and study of this kind of more esoteric thing? And this article goes section by section, faction by faction, and basically touches on the approach of each army. And I'm going to knock one out really quick here. The Spires have no concept of how to answer the question, right? They are really a non-magical race of the setting, which is interesting. None of their research can help them access this thing. So it's foreign to them, which makes them a compelling, I think, villain when it comes to this discussion. But for the rest of us, what is magic? Well, the way that I'm going to explain it is magic is the ability to alter the physical world, which we call balance, with powers from beyond it or from within it. These are powers you tap into, and you're manifesting your will into reality to change its laws and its rules. This is true if you are a scholar of the 100 kingdoms who taps into raw or wild magics of imbalance, if you are a sorcerer king who plunges, into the earth to find avatars of primordial magic, or a Dweghom who channels primordial power of war specifically. You tap into something else to change the world that we live in. Okay, that's not a perfect description, but what are the practical limits that we can discuss? Well, there's generally the idea that if you don't have the strength of will, intelligence, or acumen to direct the powers that you're trying to tap into, things will go very badly for you. Explosions, new natural formations, uncontrollable destruction, and death can definitely follow. And so everyone, in every species, is willing to take a step back from what is technically possible and have a little bit of caution and say, okay, how are we going to approach this safely? And so we are introduced to the great dichotomy of magic that almost every fantasy setting has, which is suppressing it makes us feel safer because we need to feel comforted and secure in our world. We need its order. We need the natural rules and structure of the universe to feel like it's the kind of place you could raise a family in. That being said, we also desperately want to use magic and master it so that we can change the world to persevere and outlast our enemies. And that duality manifests differently from faction to faction. Now, as a quick rundown, the 100 Kingdoms can be seen as a place that really cracks down on the gifted, as we'll call it. If you have the gift of magic, you're somewhat ostracized a little bit, in that people generally don't trust you unless you're willing to go to a college to learn to control what you've been gifted with. This is a innate tapping into some kind of connection, some other worldly power. But basically forcing all kids who are gifted to go to magic college to get disciplined in this study is essentially how the government aims to keep its citizens safe. So we'll put them all off to the side. However, if you go to that school at college and you have acumen, you have ambition, And once you can demonstrate a lot of control and eventually mastery, you can leave that college with an immense amount of political and military sway. You need to be able to deliver consistently and safely, because these are, by nature, highly educated, sharp, and capable people. Something that makes them both deadly, within the king's court as it does on the battlefield. Now, because it's kind of a forced life, though, many people within the 100 Kingdoms will try to hide their gifts, because revealing them essentially means your life is going to be stolen from you, which is a tough call. For some people, that would be a step up. For others, it's a step down. But if you choose to run away from this, you're going to find yourself getting tracked down by witch hunters eventually, so you're going to need to keep it together and keep your cover going well. And I wanted to start with the 100 Kingdoms because to me they really form a good baseline for magic thought. Right? It's seen as a gift, but is immediately tempered and directed like a trade in a trade school. So even though the wizard is kind of considered lightly an other, in quotes, they can provide enough back to society to earn and garner respect. But they're still citizens, they're still, they still serve a function to the state, and they're still treated like people. The Nords, on the other hand, do not care much for magic, specifically, unless it comes from the ordained roles in society, like shaman or vulvas, who fill the role of mystic, seer, wise folk, that kind of thing. Now, if a Nord is not interested in pursuing those specific roles within the village, they are likely to suppress whatever makes them special in terms of magical acumen. So while the roles to use magic directly exist, it's much more undisciplined, of course, because there's no formal study going on between these characters. And while that does have a place in society, there's also this kind of cultural understanding of like, dude, don't be weird, right? Unless you're going to lean all the way in and become the next shaman or something like that, everyone's like, don't be weird. So there is kind of a mild shunning going on. So again, their approach to this kind of dichotomy is, we're going to really, really focus magical understanding to the personal research of these particular sects, meaning shamans, probably the mystic order of witches and shamans and stuff like that. So completely unencouraged, not outlawed, but unencouraged, and it's all about your own personal discipline and acumen. Now, on the other side of the human scale from Nords, remember we got our baseline out of the way, we went to less magic. Now we're going to go to the two more magically gifted human factions, and that is the Sorcerer Kings and the City-States. And they contrast really well because of their worldview shaping their approach to magic. I want to start off, I did a series on both of these factions, and both of them were integral to the story of the fall of Haslia, the birth of the Old Dominion as we know it as the Death Faction. Their work together brought down the Mad God. Now, some of this, cabal of sorcerers and stuff like that, some of them saw a future where their understanding of the divine could be harnessed as technology. This technology could improve the state itself, and so they went off and founded the city-states. The others went on and harnessed magic as a way to rebuild the world as they saw fit, rather than simply studying it, and those are the Sorcerer Kings. And naturally, the way mages and wizards fit into their societies are very different. For my opinion, the city-states treat the divine much more of like a science that we're still articulating. It is much more a part of the everyday life than a 100 Kingdoms person, at least kind of their connection to abstract and esoteric stuff is. We have some city-states with functional mini-deities. Some of them have arcane weapons, automata, and gifted here are treated like people who essentially have like an unnatural or unusual aptitude for science of any kind. Chemistry, engineering, and that kind of thing. You would just say, oh wow, this kid is like exceptional at blank. Magic is kind of just treated as one of those things, another skill that someone can have. So, gifted here have the world very much open to them. Your skills could be applied as an apprentice of a specific industry that uses wizards, maybe magic of some kind of process in manufacturing or something like that. You could study under a noble, or work for the government in keeping the divine primordial shard at the heart of the city active. And this is a way more rewarding environment. And if I was to be born gifted here in this setting, like with natural magical acumen, I would want to be in the city-states. There's opportunity. There's a little bit more optimism, I think, than some of the other factions. But there's this ethos of creativity that surrounds these gifts. And what binds them from going too far are the societal carrots and sticks. Expectations and the throttling of access to research equipment by your superiors. So while it's much more casual and open to magical stuff, the knowledge base, the formal education to get to the really dangerous stuff is just not available to people. That requires years of apprenticeship and discipline and so on. Then there are the Sorcerer Kings, who lean the hardest into the typical, mageocracy idea. If you are born gifted, your family has a moral and legal obligation to present you to the local Raj, your local ruler. Your family will be rewarded a sum of money to offset the loss of this worker, right? This child that was born into their family, and that kid is taken by the state. They will be raised by mages to serve mages and advance the agenda of mages, no question asked. Now, where the city-states dive into the idea of primordial shards being the core of their research, the Sorcerer Kings walked away from that great Haslia event, the Fall, with kind of a different path or ethos about them. A lot of their military might, of course, comes from summoning ethereal beings into reality, which they do by crossing into a hell realm and binding these things to their service, which they do through sheer willpower and discipline. Which is a wildly different approach to magic than all these other factions. Rather than kind of just tapping into something that maybe is just a natural outpouring of energy, kind of a mote of magic here or there, these guys are like ripping a hole, going in and pulling out monsters that they need. And that means that the throttle of why they are not the end-all be-all is actually very clear for them, and that is, you can only summon what you can subdue. And there are just normal human limits, I think. Many wizards will go into this kind of hell realm and get themselves killed in either trying to command a beast. Many have exploded as their will can no longer guide the numerous creatures they summon. Like their minds are being pulled in too many directions on the battlefield. And so this one is much, much more dependent, I think, on the personal skill and personality of the magic wielder. Whereas the other schools are much more formal and it's more about the body of education. The difference in their types of magic and the summoning and stuff, I think it just draws on a different kind of mental resource. So rather than snooty academics, this is the faction of mad scientists. Now, those are the human factions, and I think that represents a fair spectrum. From least magical hype to most, you probably go Nords, 100 Kingdoms, City-States, Sorcerer Kings. They all tolerate it, but they have varying degrees of social acceptance and how they encourage magic to be expressed. As we look around to the other factions, the Old Dominion doesn't have much of this. It's clear that they channel the power and devotion of Haslia, specifically one being. They're not tapping into any kind of naturally occurring magic. They're not piercing any kind of veil. Haslia exists and power manifests within these troops, essentially animating them and bringing the Old Dominion back as a faction. So they kind of start our non-traditional human look at these other factions who tend to really tap into a single primordial energy. Old Dominion is Haslia. The Dweghom, similarly, who are the dwarves of the faction if you're new to Conquest, clearly channel a lot of their magical acumen from the primordial god War. War exists in a prison deep within the earth itself. They burrowed in there, tapped into the essence of a god, and as they do all kinds of really cool magics, which, in a setting where dwarves know magic, it's all based around fire and ash. And unlike the Old Dominion, where the magic that animates them also enslaves them, because you can't do anything outside of Haslia's will, the Dweghom have a lot of freedom in how they handle themselves. They aren't directed by war moment to moment in the same way that Haslia's will is an infection upon the Old Dominion leadership. Now, there isn't too much info on what it means to be a fledgling wizard amongst the Dweghom, like what magic school or apprenticeship looks like. I imagine it's like Hogwarts, but everyone's 3 feet shorter. But we do know that Holdregs will readily entreat with Hellbringer wizards because of the devastation that they can bring. I mean, it's immense. And so as long as everyone is dripping with gold and glory afterwards, the wizards are happy to help and don't seem to be scorned at all by the greater society. I'm sure individual holds will have their own temperaments or whatever, but I mean, as a faction, there's no unifying, like, ew, those guys? You know, your three pillars that hold up any hold are going to be your Hellbringer wizards, your priests, and the regs who are in control of the masses, and it doesn't seem like any one of those is just kind of generally despised. And lastly, I want to talk about the Wadrun, because they stand 1 degree apart from even the Dweghom when it comes to channeling or tapping into those primordial powers. Instead of a single deity like the Dweghom or the Old Dominion, there are a total of 4 primordial powers that the Wadrun tap into with their cults, and how they achieved this is a huge mystery. To give a brief backstory, the Spires were trying to create an artificial life form. These are essentially their genetic test tube created orcs. The first few experiments failed spectacularly, and they kept trying different iterations of this until they stumbled upon a sample group of 4 created, and these 4 were different because they had access to immense magical power, and the Spire don't understand magic. They're trying to do these things to see how it works, but they just can't understand it. They didn't unfortunately have time to crack the code though, because they were attacked by Dweghom, and the Wadrun were released and basically set wild into the setting. Whatever this spark of the divine is, has completely defined the face of the faction. The 4 primordial powers are death, famine, war, and conquest, and what keeps the Wadrun from going too far with magic is simply reverence. These divine beings are seen as the source, in the right combination, of the Wadrun spirit. It's not something to be mastered or dominated, it is a force of nature like a river, and that means it can be understood but never directed or controlled. So it's a much more naturalistic understanding of magic, and we don't go too far because why would we? And what all these factions have in common is a mix of formal understanding of the role of magic, but wildly different worldviews on how it fits into their particular universe. You know, the Nords see it largely as going against nature, unless it fits into their worldview of, being wielded by specific people in their society, who are more or less outcasts unless they're needed. The 100 Kingdoms see it as a regularly occurring, natural phenomenon that has to be treated with diligence and discipline to be useful or respectable in any kind of way. The city-states see it as a tool in the toolbox. The Sorcerer Kings see it as the salvation to reshape the world, even if it means cannibalizing the families of its own citizenry. And in every circumstance, there are societal expectations of control that are every bit as binding as an actual law or ordinance, an ethos of restraint, but for different reasons, some of them practical, and some are just legal. Everyone has a reason to chill. Now, what makes this cool? I want to talk about magic. Like I said, I wanted to get it out of the way before I really dove into the lore compendium to go further into the idea of how these different factions are approaching magic. There are a few instances of primordial gods interacting directly with their servants. And we have stuff like, schisms within the churches of various factions, maybe some interesting ideas of new types of descriptions of magic being rolled out within that lore compendium. And so the things that you're fighting are going to look different if you are fighting a 100 Kingdoms wizard versus, say, a Sorcerer King wizard. Even if they both cast Fireball, it's going to manifest differently based on how they interact with magic as a whole. And as Ea becomes the battleground for more and more of these primordial beings, I really can't wait to see the different ways magic develops from here. Now, my army, of course, as I've said before, is Nords. I am not a big magic user by any stretch. Me, I trust the axe. And I leave the weird stuff to, the people on the skirts of society. But I would love to hear about you. What is your favorite faction's understanding of magic? For me, to joking aside about the Nords, I really do like this kind of old Nordic story archetype of, the cold-driven snow, and the crow brings you to a hag raven who can foresee things and give you wisdom. But I wouldn't want to be a gifted person there. I still maintain that city-states is the best. It might not immediately put you in the highest echelon of society like Sorcerer Kings, but that's okay. I don't need eyes all on me all the time. I'd love to hear your thought process between that, and let me know if the Lore Compendium series sounds interesting to you. Share this with a friend, and thank you so much for listening. And please consider using my Para Bellum link in my description or link tree down below, because it does an immense amount to help my family. So thank you so much for listening, and I'll catch you next time. Happy wargaming.